are hardwired for collaboration. It's the reason we humans have survived so successfully, how we're arguably the most successful species on the planet. As individuals, our primitive ancestors were weak, without tooth or claw. They were vulnerable to predation, starvation. But when they connected, when they communicated, and when they collaborated in tribes, they were unbeatable. And it's a tradition that we've continued to this day. We collaborate with our friends, families, work colleagues to create things that are bigger, better, bolder than we can do on our own. You might have heard this old saying, "It takes a village to raise a child." At its heart, it's about collaboration in the community, how children benefit from interactions with a wide variety of people so that they can grow up healthy, happy, with resilience and a strong sense of self to carry them forwards into their adult lives. Sounds like a really brilliant concept, doesn't it? Except, what if you don't happen to live in that kind of a close-knit community? Maybe you live in a larger town or city, or perhaps your lifestyle precludes you from getting to know your neighbours, your community that well. You'd certainly be less inclined then just to leave the future of your children in their hands. And what about our societies in general? We seem to have more online connections than real-life ones. So I think we need to reconsider how we raise our children, and in particular, our influences on them. I think we need to have a more three-dimensional approach, one that includes the people in our here and now, but is also a collaboration between generations. Because life is not flat, it's not two-dimensional. Consider this. What if you were able to influence future generations just as you've been influenced by past ones, but in a way that cherry-picks the very best of your habits, layers on your own learnings, so that you pass forward a joint effort of behaviours, the old and the new? We are all shaped by three elements. Now, firstly, our environment, which we can change to some degree, the homes we live in, the workplaces we show up at, the bubbles we create around ourselves through our use of social media, our interactions with the world at large, the tribes that we become a part of. But that's still in the here and now. That's a wallpaper to our lives. So what about the second element? Now, this is our genetic inheritance. It's the thread that ties the generations together. And it's the thing that creates the most obvious appearances that we see, things like the colour of your hair, how long your fingers are, how big your feet are, how tall or how short you are. I know that I share the colour of my eyes with my late father, as I do with my two daughters. So that thread of genetic inheritance weaves through at least 3 generations. And if you take a look at these 2 photos, the one on the left is my mother. It's taken when she was around 4 years old in the early 1940s. Now, you can tell it's a really old photo, by the way. They weren't allowed to smile in those days. The one on the right is my daughter, taken at around the same age. She'd just woken up from a nap, which is why she looks a bit grumpy. And she will be forever grateful that I've used this picture on this massive screen. But they share certain similarities in their appearances, despite more than 60 years separating them. Now, what's perhaps even more remarkable is my mother was born in Malaysia to a Chinese mother and a Scottish father, a bit of a gene mix going on there. My daughter, therefore, shares her genes, along with those of my father, with his Armenian inheritance, and my husband with his half English, half Czech offering. Now, that really is a collaboration of genes going on. But it's more than just your physical appearances that get passed forward. Your talents do too. If you're artistic, creative, chances are one of your ancestors was too. If you're sporty, athletic, chances are one of your ancestors was too. If you're practical, logical, the chances are someone in your family history was too. And it might even extend to things like your propensity for seasickness, whether you instinctively love animals or shy away from them. whether you hate small, confined spaces without having any real personal experience of them. It's like a genetic postcard from your past relatives. But talent struggles to flourish unless it's nurtured under the right circumstances, which leads us rather neatly into the last element, our learned behaviours. Now this is perhaps the most interesting of the three because our conditioning is learned, which means that we can teach it forwards. It forms the framework under which we all live, creating our social norms, our customs. There's a sad statistic in the UK that 51% of adults who were abused as children will go on to suffer domestic abuse as adults. It's really hard to break free from your early learned behaviours, your conditioning. If all you know throughout your childhood is hate, fear, pain, subconsciously you may be driven to seek out more. It's not a considered choice, it's bizarrely part of your survival mechanism that is mortally afraid of change. It promotes survival above everything else, above your comfort, above your happiness. And it fears change in case the new situation is worse. So it seeks more of the same. Now, it's this same survival mechanism that prompts us to mirror our parents. So despite most of our best efforts, we will inevitably turn into our parents. Not all of you. Some of you will run in the opposite direction. But how many of you were told as children to finish everything on your plates? Now, this wasn't an uncommon saying in households in the 50s, 60s, 70s, because our parents grew up in a war or post-war period, a time of deprivation. And it feeds forwards, excuse the pun, to the next generation, to my generation, who then feeds it forwards to the next. Now, I might not use exactly those same words that my parents did when I talk to my children. Instead, I might say something along the lines of, don't take too much. But the sentiment is the same. Don't waste food. So just have a think about what words, what teachings are you harbouring from the past, pushing forwards into the future unconsciously. Now, it's more than just your table habits. What if your very thoughts are driven by the past? Does that then mean we have an open door into the future to influencing our sons, daughters, grandchildren, and even further forwards? What better way to pass that knowledge on than through your family stories, through your family recipes, through your holiday traditions, a collaboration of precious information being handed down through the generations. When my youngest daughter was around 3 years old or so, she went through a short period of time talking about a man in our house. She said he was funny and he made her laugh. Now, after we'd run through the house, checking under the beds, in the wardrobes for random men who might be there, when we questioned her further, she said it was her granddad, which was rather surprising given that her granddad, my father, had died more than 15 years before she was born. But she knew him. She knew him through the stories we told at family gatherings. We talk about him frequently. I like to think that we hold a place for him at our table. And we can't talk about our ancestors without talking about that subject, death. Now, if we're lucky, we get to know some of our ancestors, hopefully our parents, maybe grandparents, maybe even your great-grandparents. But when we lose them, talking about them, remembering them is the next best thing. It keeps their memory alive. It allows their influence to continue onwards. One of my dad's quirks was that he wouldn't allow plastic tubs, milk bottles to be brought to the dining table. So we always had to pour milk and cream into jugs, and gravy came out in gravy boats. And I still do that. I have a fabulous collection of jugs. So, I would like to invite you now to think about your own past ancestors, to think about what their influence has been on you, what their legacy is, and what it means to you. I'd ask you to close your eyes. Don't worry, I'll tell you when to open them at the end. Place one hand on the opposite shoulder. It doesn't matter which hand you use, as long as it goes on your own shoulder. Take a moment to focus your attention on your shoulder. Feel the weight of your hand there, the warmth of it. Perhaps give your shoulder a gentle squeeze. With your eyes still closed, you can put your hand back in your lap, and keeping your attention focused on your shoulder, just remember what it felt like to have your hand there. The weight of it, the warmth, that gentle squeeze. But instead of thinking about it being your hand on your shoulder, just imagine it's the hands of your ancestors, your parents, aunts, uncles, grandparents, and even further back, generations of ancestors standing behind you, supporting you, lending you their postcards of genetic inheritance, passing on their habits, their behaviours that feed into who you are today, that create your unique family cultures. Just imagine that. You can open your eyes now. So, with this knowledge, what habits, what behaviours are you going to be passing forwards into the future? Not just the ones you happen to do so without thought, but the ones you choose to do so consciously. Think about things like your use of technology. Think about the language you use when you talk about yourself or when you talk about others, when you talk to them. Think about your habits around the home, perhaps at the dining table. And what about how important you make them feel, how generous you are with your attention? And think about your attitudes to things like your health or the environment, because these are the things that get passed forward, these everyday habits and behaviours. These are your legacy of influence. Because it doesn't just take a village to raise a child. It takes a collaboration of generations to raise a child. Thank you.